Welcome to the 1455 Summer Festival. I'm going to get us started with our next panel. This one's super exciting for me. Welcome to our session for the panel entitled Comic Creation, the Art of That Wild Market. Thanks so much for being with us here today. I'm excited and my panelists are stoked. This is part of the 1455 Summer Festival hosted by 1455 Literary Arts. Today we have two inspiring comic and graphic novel illustrators with us, So first off, I am Jessi Lewis. I'm a writer, a essayist, and a poet, and I've always loved graphic novels and comics, but I know very little about them. So I thought that I would bring in some comic artists and graphic novel artists who do. So first off, we have Chad Lewis. He's a comic artist and assistant professor, currently teaching illustration at Kent State University. He has worked with Boom Studios on the graphic novel Planet of the Apes Visionaries, as well as Kong, Gods of Skull Island, and contributed inks for the Wizard Beach series. He has worked within the comic field with short comics for a diverse range of clients, such as Marvel, Adobe Students, and the Betty Ford Center and Case Western Reserve. So thanks, Chad, for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Alrighty, and next we have David Wilson. He's an illustrator, writer, designer, and filmmaker from Ohio. He's the author of The Everyday, co-author of Russ Beltracana, writer and director of the Disposal of Dead Ned feature film, and his latest project is illustrating Play Like a Girl, a middle grade graphic novel set to be published in 2023 at Harper Collins. So welcome, David.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. All right, thanks, guys. This is super exciting for me. I'm really excited to see what you have to say about some questions that I've written up. Full disclosure, I do write up the questions beforehand just to be kind to myself and then to be kind to Chad and David as well. But you'll see that I look down at the screen every once in a while, and that's all right. So, okay, so let's start off with David. What are you working on right now or are most excited about that's coming up for you in illustration?
Yeah, so right now I'm working on Play Like a Girl, which is a middle grade graphic novel written by my wife and her experience playing football in the 7th grade. We're in the sketch stage of that right now. So a lot of tweaking back and forth with our editor, making sure all the themes and the arcs are working, as well as the pacing and kind of flow of the story. And then in the background, I'm doing illustrations for the Boston Globe and book cover design for Belt Publishing, which is a local press, indie press up here in Cleveland. And then playing Pokemon with 2 little girls. And I'm almost a Pokemon master.
Nice. All right. So Chad, same question for you. What are you working on right now or you're most excited about that's coming up in your illustration work?
Well, like you mentioned in your great introduction, I'm an assistant professor at KSU right now, and I'm teaching graphic narrative. So I'm kind of going through the process of, I've been doing this for the last 5 or 6 years, and now I need to figure out how to make it palatable and kind of expand on all the stuff I've learned, which has been a blast and definitely really interesting. And then let's see, I'm working with Philip Johnson, who's currently writing Superman, on creator owned project that we're making our way through that's super exciting, and some other small projects that I am too embarrassed to talk about or too terrified to talk about, but I'm having a blast with them.
All right, very cool. Okay, so let's move forward here. I want to make sure that we stick within our time limit, but hold on one second. Got a little bit of instability, but I think we'll be okay. Okay, so let's move forward. And when you are working on these projects, the ones that you're excited about right now, did you pitch these or were you pursued for these projects? So Chad, your project with Johnson, were you pitched or were you pursued for that?
Well, this is the project with Philip. He and I have known each other for a while, originally from Kong of Skull Island, Kong, God of Skull Island, which is a great title. But those projects that were working with Boom, I worked with Boom, let's see, way back in the day, not way back in the day, it feels like forever ago, but they found my work that I did working with Adobe on a student project that I did while I was in graduate school. And so they hit me up about doing some sample pages with them. And I know sample pages within the comics field is kind of a touchy subject of doing free work. I couldn't have been more excited as far as like, I'll do all the sample pages you want. So I did some sample pages with them on some different properties and landed on Kong of Skull Island and met Philip there through that process of working. So it's kind of I met him through Boom and then have been working kind of back and forth with him.
Nice. Okay. All right. So that makes sense. And it's interesting too to see that like shift from grad school. I think a lot of creatives have like a sudden surprise when that happens. So that's always like a tricky moment. It's kind of nice. As a creative writer, it's kind of nice to hear somebody be like, oh yeah, this is what I was willing to do because you had to do it. All right. So David, how about you with Harper Collins with that one that's coming up? Did you pitch that one or did they come to you?
My wife and I pitched that. So any work I think I've ever had in my life, for better or worse, no one's ever came up to me and said, hey, we want you to do work. It's always been me being like, hey, give me work. And the graphic novel was kind of the same. We came up with an outline and I did, I think 30 sample pages. And then we queried to agents. And then we went through that interview process. And then we worked with our agent to tweak it. And then we pitched to publishers, editors.
Okay.
So that's kind of how that came about.
Yeah. For us, when I'm doing that with a novel now, that's always like very stressful, the amount of time that takes. It's like, or at least it's not that long, but it feels like it's forever. You know, when
it's a lot of second guessing and self-doubt too, which is never a good place to be. But
well, I don't think that goes away, to be honest. Like, I don't feel like with artists, like, I don't think artist writers that, you know, push to try to get something accepted, you know, you're Pulitzer Prize winner, you're still going to feel that way. So, okay. So that's awesome. Like, it's good to get like a nice balance, understand how things are produced. And then this one was actually really helpful for me because I want to make sure that I understand what you guys are working with and the difference in different forms. And you guys can just take this away, run with it. So explain the difference in working with a serialized property versus a full graphic novel, and how is this process and mindset different?
But I think we can go a couple routes with this one, Chad, because I think there's two routes to go. We talked about this last night when we were kind of prepping for this talk. One is the idea of like a serialized narrative. You know, on that end, there's pressure to come up with something consistently, where the book I'm working on now, we have a big deadline. You know, we've got a year to work on a book or 2 years, whatever you sign in your contract. But if you're doing like monthly comics or comic strips, like I was doing for the Everyday, that's once a week, there's a lot of pressure there. And then I also think we could talk about, you know, Chad, you've worked on properties that have kind of, you know, when you're working on Kong, or I know you did Alien sketches for the Alien franchise, there's a lot of different rules that I don't have when Misty and I are telling our story of her playing football.
Right. Yeah. That's, first of all, your Everyday, which is excellent. Everybody should check out the Everyday David's comic strip. That is, I mean, we have talked in past weeks before you got too busy with the Harper Collins about having to mine creatively, you know, on a timeline where I know the aspect of having to make, you know, to have these deadlines that you have to meet. I did some inking on a property called Wizard Beach, and it's just kind of feels like you're clocking in and clocking out. You know, I have my pages, I submit them, that's done. I can't wrap my head around the creative side of having to physically make and own content, you know, on a timeline. It's a wild thing, because if it's a big, large, nebulous project like the Play Like a Girl, it's imposing, but you kind of have this, you know, this time where you can, it's like a slow boil. Whereas the Everyday, to me, is this terrifying thing where you have to be consistently creative on a tight timeline. My hat's off to anybody who can do it, because I find that so imposing.
And I think there's a parallel too. You know, you and I always talk about when you read comics, I think you know that you did the research, but it's like 3 seconds per panel that you look at a comic panel. And as comic artists, you have to at some point say that panel's good enough, even
Yeah.
if it's not great. And I think serialized comics for me turned out to be that, where it's like, if I want one a week by Friday, I have to have something that's good enough to stick to the schedule. And
Right.
that's what you have to say. That's okay.
Yeah. Yeah. The working with the editors at Boom, the feedback I got on most everything wasn't, hey, this doesn't look right. It was time, like, keep going. Your affectation in the background is is wonderful. That's a wonderful idea to try to do beautiful backgrounds, but really that, if you break it down to 3 seconds per panel should be emblazoned on my wall in huge letters, because it dictates so much of, you have to keep that in your mind as you're working. Otherwise you can go down a rabbit hole that's 4 a.m. you get out of your comic haze. It's definitely can be a tricky process.
That'll be your first tattoo, 3 seconds per panel, like right on the back of your hand.
Yeah.
Whatever your non-drawing hand is, so when it's on the table, you just like look down at it.
Done. Great.
All right. So, well, and that sets you up for different scenarios with like the collaborative team, right? Because then you have, well, it sounds like, David, you're working with your wife as your writer, correct? Or at least is the concept, right? So that's an interesting, that's a panel in itself as a relationship. But okay, so what is the trickiest part about working with a team you may not know that well? So moving with in a different direction and producing in a time frame. So you started to talk about time frame a little bit, which to me sounds the most stressful, because I have to avoid my perfectionism even in my own time frame. So for you guys, like in terms of working with a team and that time frame, what do you struggle with the most?
I think for me, I'll go into like a quick little story, but it's communication. And I think sometimes, depending on who the person is, like language isn't the same. So I was working for one company, and when I got hired, they hired me for pencils. And in, the comic language I knew, pencils meant pencil sketches.
Mm-hmm.
So I did all these pencil sketches, a whole comic of pencil sketches. I turned it in thinking I would get edits, and then I'd get back and put my inks down, which are final lines. They ended up using my pencils as the finals, because to them, pencils meant final.
Oh.
We never talked about it. It never popped up.
Yeah.
And I remember seeing the colored copies, and I'm like, why did you use my pencils? Like, I'll ink it for free. Like, these are bad. My name's on this. These are really bad.
Yeah.
And they said, we can't have you ink it because of the deadline, the timeline. And all because of that wrong definition that the editor I shared. Like, there's work out there that I'm like, ostrich put my head in the sand.
That's face meltingly frustrating.
Yeah.
It's a good question. I think for me, the Kong thing being the first professional outing, I really wanted to get to know the writer, and was really excited about that process. And kind of just, there's an editor who you're in the comic production process. You have, as far as working with a larger company like Boom, you have your writers, your editors, your or I guess your artists, being, you could have somebody who does all of it, you could have somebody who does pencils, inks, colors, and starting at that process and being kind of new to it, I was desperate to talk to the writer, to get to know this writer, because I wanted to be on the same page. I had never envisioned something as terrible as what David just described, but something along that same line of wanting to make sure that you're on the same page creatively. So I started emailing the writer and started spitballing with great ideas for the project. Meanwhile, this project has to go. We have to move, and I'm championing revisions and more ideas and character designs. And I get hit up by the editor. It's like, hey, we really we like all these changes. It's fine to be creative, but this is on a production line, and getting to know people kind of has to happen while you're producing good work. So, my inclination is to get to know people before collaborating with them. In comics, you just kind of have to trust that process. which is going to inevitably fail you, and you're going to look like an ostrich with your head in the sand, especially before you can start reading the room and, you know, really kind of understanding, maybe asking the right questions, not to put that on you, David, but you know, like, I think now you wouldn't make that same mistake. It's just a learning process for anybody who's getting into it.
Yeah, and that makes sense. It reminds me of I had a short story published once, and the editor really wanted to cut the last line. I was like, no, that's my last line. Like, you can't take that final tone at all. And then I look at it, you know, a couple years later, I'm like, oh, that line should have been cut. Like, they were absolutely correct. So is there anything in there in that experience where you're like, oh man, this is a thing where somebody showed me something I should be doing, or somebody like improved something and I was like, oh yeah, that's where it goes. And that's a surprise question. So if it's like, takes you a moment, I get it.
No, for me, it's very relevant. So Play Like a Girl that Missy and I are working on, it's easily been the most humbling experience of my life. And not that like I'm bad at what I do, but working, it was my first time working with like an editor, like I've worked with editors, but not on a comic.
Right.
Or someone who didn't have like, as an artist, the editing, like Chad said, it's a lot of like timeline or, you know, fix this art. This Play Like a Girl, being close to Misty and working with her and working with our editor, it's humbling to know you should trust your editor because they're brilliant and you're not. You know, like, that's their job. Right. And they're good at it, and they're going to show you why. And if you let them, the payoffs are immense. At least in my case right now, like every step of the way, every edit we make, you know, is a revelation. And we just go, oh, look at that. Like, then we go back to our first draft and we go, oh no. So it is one thing I always see on Twitter. There's like an editor debate. Like, I don't want an editor. It's like, are you crazy? Yeah. Their job is to make you wonderful. Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm a technician, and I think my comfort level, and not that I don't want to write my own stories, but my comfort level on a professional level is, you know, perspective and figures. And every time I start making decisions that I feel like make a lot of sense, and then I bring those to somebody. This is mostly finding this with my creator-owned work, but I also found this working with Dana Gould on the Planet of the Apes Visionary book that I worked with, was that there's people who are storytellers that are exactly where they should be, who are writers who know how to craft a scene, who trusting that process of the writer's mind is invaluable to setting a scene. I want to illustrate that scene, but you know, there's real power in letting people who are experts in that area shine. You know what I mean? Like, it's you can make comics on your own, or you can work in a team. And every time I'm realizing that the team is, if you have the right team, is more than the sum of its parts.
Yeah. That makes perfect sense.
I have not learned that gracefully.
All right. So in terms of that time crunch, you talked about, like, especially with certain projects are under much more of a speed requirement than others. But when you're working creatively under a time crunch, what is your strategy to maintain the quality of your work or your style? I think that's a tricky thing. I'm talking like down to like the brass tacks of this. Like, are you working till 3 a.m. or do you have a certain pattern that you have to work with during the day? Like, what do you do to make sure you're producing something strong in that time crunch?
David, go for it. I have only chaos.
My go-to is changing the style or the medium I'm using, and that's not always good or easy. For one instance, in my illustration career, I was getting hired a lot to do these ink spot portraits, and I would do the portraits in pencil, and then I would ink them on tracing paper, and it would take a while for the ink to dry. And if I messed up, my floor would be littered with tracing papers because I'd mess up so much. And that was fine for magazines. But when I started getting hired for newspapers, the deadlines became, here's the subject on Tuesday, and it's due Wednesday at 9. And it became unfeasible to do in traditional medium. So I switched to a tablet.
Right.
So that was like one where I was like, okay, this is how I'm going to make it work for me. It's a little different, but that's the name of the game. Or, if I see a deadline, and if I'm given a deadline and it's short, I'll say, okay, I can already axe out that I'm not going to do details or painting or this or that, and try to focus where I'm strongest at that doesn't take me as long, or is maybe that I'm better at, or I can make work. So I think being kind of adaptable is, for me, the way to meet that challenge.
Yeah, that's really good. That's really good insight. I think there's a YouTube creator named Mark Crille. I think he is does some work with Dark Horse Comics, and he was showing on his YouTube channel how to reuse a background for multiple panels. He drew the background, he owns the content, and then he would, he's just talking this really practical, granular solution to something that's going to be 8 hours multiple times. Again, that 3-second rule comes into play, where your work is, the reader might say in the back of their mind, that background looks similar to the last one. That's the difference between you getting sleep or not. There's things that you have to do like that. When I'm at the start of any project, I always like to amass a file on my computer. I say file, but I like to litter my computer desktop with things I'm inspired by. And I always find myself grabbing a slew of different artists that I like for projects, just getting those engines turning creatively. And my better angel over here has me looking at Paul Pope and Paul Azaceta, people that are using line elegantly and quickly, and they're nailing their figures and they're nailing their perspective, but they're not the Arthur Adams or the Alex Rosses over here who are using a 0.001 micron. You know what I mean? Like, there's who you're looking at matters so much for just the energy you have going into a project. And this shoulder with all of the people that I shouldn't be deferring to is so much heavier than the other shoulder. But yeah, it's having kind of a game plan for how you're going to proceed with a project, really.
Okay. So it sounds like both of you have kind of moved towards that tablet process, moving away from more of the hand-drawn stuff. Is that accurate, or are we somewhere in between?
I've been using the tablet a lot for commission jobs.
Mm-hmm.
I hate computers. Like, I don't really like them at all. So anything I do personal now, it's very, with my hands. Like, if I have time, I guess that it's become like tablet is work, and then traditional is where I play, and it's collage and painting and making a mess. I would like to do that more for illustration, but the deadlines and sometimes the pay don't always add up to make it worth it.
Right.
With revisions and notes, and then it's like, oh, I got to redo this. And
yeah,
so it's the computer and the tablet, it's a great tool to get work done,
right,
for me.
Yeah, it's funny because having parameters makes you more creative. I think having watercolors where you have to let this thing dry, and you have 4 tubes of paint that you need to make a full full composition out of that is singing, is in some ways more easy to wrangle creatively than you open up Adobe and you have a wheel with endless possibility, and you're not going to have any happy accidents. The accidents have been engineered out of the process. So it's the necessity of the industry, because David's describing, what was it, Boston Globe, would you say was the timeline, the turnaround there?
Yeah, it's usually 2 days, but it has been one night, and that's not the art director's fault. That's nobody's fault. It's just how the publishing newspaper industry works.
Yeah.
Just so.
And we had chatted about this earlier, but if you're working with watercolors and they take to dry them, and it takes 30 minutes per wash, not 30 minutes, 10 minutes per wash to fully dry something, all of a sudden you've been phased out of your traditional work, so it's definitely a give and a take. But I'm with you. The technology and necessity for kind of our expectations, but it's so much more fun just to have happy accidents with traditional stuff.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, well, and this is, there's a lot of layers of stuff going on here. And I know that scripts are in there too. So we'll head in that direction now. So, and this is, I find this part interesting because I tried my hand at this a little bit, and script writing is just so interesting to me because it has its own parameters. But do you have a preference in how scripts are written when you are working with them?
I don't know. Misty and I we wrote a script and then it was too loose. We thought we could just kind of talk it over. And I think I learned that that's not sustainable. We had a very loose outline and we kind of thought, if I do sketches, we can talk about them. And, we lived together, so it wouldn't have been that hard. But really, hindsight, like for our next book, we have one more book with Harper Collins. For our next one, like I would love a detailed script just to kind of cover bases and make sure. I don't know if for some reason I thought like I would have not that I'm like angry about it, but like we worked on it so close for the pitch that I thought we would be working on it together, the story aspect. But then I realized like, this isn't my story. Like, I know I helped kind of pace it or this or that, but she had to write it. And that's where it kind of got off the rails. And that's where I'm like, I wish we had a script. If it were my own book, I'd probably do it really loose and let myself play while I drew. But I think if it's coming from another writer, the more details, the better.
Now, I totally agree with what you're saying. But you're in purgatory right now. You're in creation purgatory. You're midway through it. But what I have read of your loose script that you're checking back in with Misty, and the dialogue feels fresh in a way that canned dialogue I just don't really see in comics a lot of times, where it feels like a script is set in stone. You guys are going back and forth on, does this work? What do you think? The bar is raised every time you drill down on something that could be, the dialogue could be tighter or looser, and so I think it's at some point there's got to be a cap on that going back and forth. But from what I've read of the book so far, it's awesome, and the writing, the dialogue is amazing. And so, from what it sounds, I would say it's a double-edged sword, being creative and also having a straight through line on how to get it done. I want as detailed a script as possible. I want to say, figure turns quarter inch to the left, like I just want to, because I want to look at reference, and I want to have a ton of reference. Again, my disgusting computer desktop that I litter with stuff, I want to be able to get as much reference for that as possible. And being in sync with the writer in that regard is really important to me.
And I think, like one last note, I think I would also take a loose script or be okay with a loose script if there's a history between the writer and I. So, if Chad and I are working on something, like I trust he might want a detailed script, but I feel like I could write 3 words on a page and trust him to work magic.
I don't know.
So there is that sense where he might not want that, but I would trust him with it. Or, maybe a writer hires an illustrator or wants to work on an illustrator with the story because of what they can bring to the story, which I always think is smart.
You almost wonder if you could just say to the other creative, like, hey, what are your favorite shows on HBO? Like try to get a flavor, and then say, oh yeah, send me a loose script, or this script needs to be so tight. If they send you something that you don't like you got to drill down exactly, because the aesthetics and kind of that energy really matters. And that's why, if you know someone, that's a great point. If you know somebody and kind of have a feel for them, there's a little bit more give and take there.
That makes sense. I think I have a self-consciousness about that question, because I feel like I'm the M. Night Shyamalan guy who's like frame by frame, like hardcore as a writer, because I don't, but it's an interesting thing to be like.
I thought you meant twists. I thought you meant twists at the end.
Surprise!
I love surprises.
Interview over.
That's funny. He is all about like that Alfred Hitchcock style of going frame by frame, and you'll notice because like he'll actually like frame in faces with literally within a frame, so like a window, when that's something that he defines in the script, exactly how the camera should be placed. And it's for a lot of people, they view that as like kind of a megalomaniac, but for me, and like I get it at the same time, like I understand it, which might mean that, you know, I'm an M. Night Shyamalan.
I think with writing a script, you know, when I write scripts or getting scripts, it's just a matter of remembering that, you know, it could be your story, but you're working with a partner.
Right.
So you always have to remember that somebody else is also interacting with what you're writing on a creator level, not just an audience.
That makes sense. All right, so let's move us forward. We've got what has been the most surprising part of the publication process for you? We've kind of dabbled around in this, but like the most frustrating, the most invigorating for you, like what are the extremes for you in this process?
So frustrating, I think for me has been just the conception of news stories and thinking you're onto something and then realizing you're not, or having a good idea and not being able to make it work. Just that the creative process is very frustrating. And I think
doing it right,
with publishing, what's invigorating for me and what I've found through signing with Play Like a Girl, at least in the kidlit market of middle grade and YA, it seems to be that the editors and the agents really only care about story. And is your story good? You know, one of the big things that I was worried about when we started pitching to agents is we put so much weight on like social media clout or popularity. And that kind of got washed away once we talked to agents and editors, and they didn't care who we were. Like, and I mean that in a good way. They just cared about the story and representing a good story and making the story the best. So there was this like, oh, you don't have to be the most popular, you just have to be good.
Right.
And I think for me, that's very invigorating.
Yeah, that's good. When I was in graduate school, I mentioned it earlier, but for my thesis, I did a kind of a discussion on information acquisition and comics, and kind of where comics fall along the line of aesthetics and what information we get from them as we're reading. And as part of the process, I did a 10-page comic that took me, I mean, it was a big chunk of 100-page thesis, but there's a comic built into it, and the comic itself took me almost as long to do 10 pages to draw this meticulously as it did to write the thing. And then I used those pages, was super proud of them, put them everywhere, and got some work from them. And what's been frustrating is being held to, we love the aesthetic in these pages, they're beautiful, we need you to do this, we'd like you to do this same thing on a timeline. You know, I had this great critical thinking, I want to say operatic, you know, 10 pages is nothing in comic world, but it took me so long because I got to, you know, the minutia of it. I got to get in there. And again, my demons over there of just, hey, there should be more foliage, or, you know, all that stuff. And it's through no fault of the commercial world. Somebody sees what you put out there and would like you to reproduce it. It's frustrating to have to use a foliage generating brush in Photoshop to accommodate the leaves that you meticulously check. You know what I mean? Like that to me, being beholden to timeframes was not an easy transition for me because I had so much creative leeway. David and I joke every once in a while of like, don't be a John Muir. The comic was about John Muir, and we always like, is that a John Muir page? Because you got to back it up if it is. So that's what was frustrating and invigorating, is really seeing just when you're working with a good team and decisions that are made that heighten your work is the coolest ever. When you have an editor that's really good, you have a writer that's giving you scenes that are just a blast visually. You know, there's moments along the way that you think, okay, comics are a medium that hold a ton of weight and are beautiful when they're done well. And it's really awesome to be able to step out during that process and notice that you're doing something that feels special, which is really cool.
Nice. Okay. we're coming towards, we're not at the end, we're coming towards the end. So I'll give you 2 more questions. This one is, what are you most excited to take on next as you look past your current work? And this can be anything. It doesn't have to be something, you know, in a current contract or anything like that. What are you most excited about, even if it's a tool that you have that's pretty sweet?
All right, well, I've been making David go first, so I'll go first. I follow a bunch of great artists on Twitter, and there's an artist named Nicole Rifkin who just did a New Yorker cover that was amazing. I started looking at her stuff, and there's a few things that she put up there that were, you know, comics that were just a single page comic kind of talking about, I think it was gardening or a garden with kind of each panel was ambient space rather than time passing. So as you're reading this piece, you're not seeing a story that's unfolding linear wise. You're seeing it's setting a mood for an overall scene. That's so inspiring to think about as far as comic production, that you can make an aesthetic mood over a page that you're reading from left to right and top to bottom. The story, you know, the overall scene hasn't changed. And I just want to explore that further. I find myself daydreaming about pages that I could build that are setting a scene and a mood. There's kind of an aesthetic, you know, an aesthetic moment that you can create. And it's not something that I've ever thought about, you know, working on a timeline with a company that you're given a script to. It kind of lines up with my aesthetics and my, frankly, my love of detail, that I could do something like that. So I'm really excited to get into that a little bit more, as well as teaching comics. I can't wait. I got teaching sequential narratives in the fall, and thinking about all the cool stuff I get to talk with them about. It's pretty exciting.
I have a book for you, Chad. I think it's called Thornhill. You'll have to look it up. But when you talk about like ambient pages, I think it's a big, thick book of just sequential spreads that tell a story.
That's so awesome and refreshing.
I want to say there's like no dialogue, or maybe there's like minimal. It's beautiful stuff, and it's just super thick. I'll give it to you. Right now, I'm very happy doing comics. I think I had never done middle grade comics before. Most of my stuff has been like adult oriented, whether it's the everyday for my life or like pitching fantasy stuff. And I'm having a really good time doing middle grade. Mm-hmm. There's a level of fun that I feel allowed to have, you know, with expressions. So I'm excited for that. And I think enough time has passed since I made my movie that's not very good, but we made a movie, and I think I want to do another one. I think like the weird
Good People's Choice. It got something great.
We did win a thing. It's like getting a tattoo. Like when you're done, you're like, I never want another one that was really, really bad. And then, you know, some time passes and you're like, that sounds like a great idea. So I think I might want to do another movie here soon and relive that.
Yeah, that makes sense. What I'm hearing from you guys is that what's so interesting to me is how graphic narratives have just like broken down genre. So like we've got middle grade, which when I was a kid, I don't remember anything middle grade-esque except for like those comics you'd see in like a grocery store, right? That was, you know, the Simpsons comics, right? That's the closest I can think of for that. And then seeing like a different genre format for what Chad's talking about, like that's so exciting to me. And like I picked up one that's, oh no, I wish I knew the artist now, but it's a graphic novel on how to make dumplings, and it's the coolest process oriented. Like that's super exciting to me. So I just like hearing it when artists are truly excited about something that's like coming up, and it feels like almost like you get wiggle room.
Yeah.
Early on is wiggle room. That's right. That's a good way to say it.
It's wiggle room and then it's not. All right. Well, let's see. For our time frame here, I want to make sure that we're staying on here. Okay, we got a little bit. We've got this last question, and this last question can be a big one. So what piece of advice would you give to someone trying to break into this area of graphic narrative? I know this is a huge one for online, it's a huge one for Twitter, it's a huge one for students, and you guys are working with all of these audiences. So what is, you know, what 2 solid pieces of advice that you would give? What would you say?
2 solid pieces of advice.
You want me to go first, Chad?
I would love that.
I think, there's the tried and true, keep going, persistence and practice. And one thing that hindsight that I've learned is how much work my wife, Misty, did in researching the publishing industry. So as an artist, I didn't know anything about agents or going on sub or querying. The world of like comics, like indie floppy comics is very small, and you have a couple publishers out there. But, Misty did months and months of research. She looked up agents, what they wanted. She looked at their Twitter profiles and gauged their personalities. She looked at all the different publishers, gauged what books they're putting out. Here's how you do it. Here's, how many weeks you need to respond. So there's all this information that if she didn't research that, I don't think we would have gotten the deal or where we are. I think that knowledge into the industry and the process of how getting a book published works was paramount to our success.
And that's such a rare gift, to have somebody who doesn't just do a passable job, but owns that challenge of finding the right people. Because you can do a passable job, and just what I've done, is just like you can go on Google and just type in basic stuff, but doing that deep dive into who the people are and to make sure you're a good fit is so important. It's so important.
Yeah, she's on Clubhouses, listening to agents and editors talk. She signed up for all the mailing lists and just.
That sentence sounded terrifying. What you did.
Yeah, no, for me too, because I'm the guy who's like in the shed. I just want to draw, and she's, she's like American or a Beautiful Mind. She's got it all up and like figuring it all out, and I'm just like, what is this?
You have red string all over.
Yeah, like this agent likes this, but this, this, and I'm like, oh, okay. But if that wouldn't have happened,
loosening her tie for some reason.
I don't think we would have broken. So,
yeah,
I think you have to be good at what you do, but there's also that extra level of work of knowing the industry that you want to be in.
Yeah, I would make an argument that every MFA program for any arts should have a class that is a requirement that is the business side of it, because I feel like that is something that a lot of people get stuck without. And I would argue that the person who should teach that class should be in a variety of locations within the genre, right? And location, you know what I mean? Like elements within the genre, so they can actually speak to what it is working with an agent. I think that's definitely something that a lot of people struggle with when they go into it. It's a second job, essentially.
You're exactly right. And I'm too lazy to do it, so I'm glad she did it. She loved it too. Like, she's still, I don't know, it's like a hobby almost, researching that stuff and following along.
Yeah, I think my first, and I've already talked about a little bit, so I don't want to belabor it too much, but really figuring out how to consistency within, making something that you've poured your heart and soul into. Great, you have to do that. Best case scenario, you have to do that on a repeated basis. So, your pages that you made perfect, if you see yourself doing that on a timeline, awesome. But you have to be realistic with, this is a production process with companies that need to have something at the end of the day. And so that's, if I could do it again, basically, is having kind of more of an even keeled approach to the first work I put out there. That, because that kind of sets the pace for you a little bit. So kind of have an idea. The other thing I would say is that being aware of the demographic that you want to work for. From working with Boom, they did have a wide variety of properties that they work with. And David, you can speak on this too. Like you said, with middle grade, but and young adult. But I notice as I get further away from just the static kind of adult comic, that there's so many intricacies and differences that you have to be aware of as you're making work early in the process. Before you commit to beautiful pages, being aware of who's going to read those pages is integral to making work that's seen and also well received.
That makes perfect sense. What I love about it is the idea that I don't know. I see this for a lot of artists, writers, creatives. When they start off, they have this dedication to themselves because they've been told that they can lose themselves, right? This idealism of like maintaining your own style and being you. And like that's so important. But then they're tested, right, as they go along. And with every test they grow. And then all of a sudden they look back and they're like, oh yeah, I am not that person. I am not the me I was. But I held on to it, which was still a good, struggle to take on. I think that's really important. It's cool to hear it from you guys, the idea that you just need to know where you're headed and be realistic about it rather than hold on to that idealism. But like, at the same time, that idealism isn't bad. You just got to grow with it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think being open to kind of where the wind takes you. I never thought I'd be drawing middle grade comics. Never. Like, it's never been my interest.
You and I have pitched so many gross sci-fi shoot 'em ups, that not sci-fi, fantasy, stuff like that. And to see you take off in that regard is so cool. Really exciting.
And it's fun. And I didn't know I would love it. And I didn't know, I'm not saying, that I'm amazing at it, but I feel pretty confident in it. And I didn't know that I would. And I think just allowing myself to say, okay, let's do that. I've benefited from just being that open to kind of like not dropping, but like pushing aside what I thought I might be.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, this has been a great conversation with you guys. Thank you so much. It's cool to end on a note like that too, like to just be like, yeah, just go into it and embrace it and feel yourself stretch. That's something that I think for all storytellers, that's something that we have to kind of recognize as we go along. Your audience changes and so do you. So that's cool. So thank you, David and Chad. You guys are fantastic. It's been awesome to have you. And if you're interested in David and Chad's work, you should absolutely find them on a 1455 site. You can find their Instagram and Twitter connections over there. So that's a great way to check out their work, see what they're up to next. And for us at 1455, I really want to thank everybody for coming in for the comic creation, the Art of That Wild Markets. Please be sure to check out 1455litarts.org in general to learn more about the organization and the free programming we have coming up. And I would love to talk to you guys at another time for 1455 and see where you're headed next. So thank you so much.
Thanks for the chance to talk here.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, I'll see you guys later. Thanks.